Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to this episode of Clearer Than Truth. I'm host Nathan Kiker, along with my co-host George Bogdan, who's out today. Our guest today is Robert Kaplan, a best-selling American author and geopolitical analyst, known for more than 20 books on foreign affairs, such as The Revenge of Geography. Kaplan served for many years as foreign affairs correspondent for The Atlantic and has written for The Washington Post, The New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and The National Interest. He also has been a member of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board, a member of the U.S. Navy's Executive Panel, and Chief Geopolitical Analyst at Stratford, and a Senior Advisor at Asia Group. Robert, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you've argued that geography and historical memory channel politics rather than determine them. Looking at U.S. China rivalry, Russia, Ukraine, and the Middle East today, where does that framework help us see clearly, and where does it break down?
Well, we have an example now in the Persian Gulf where it's all about geography. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest, but there's only 2 or 3 miles each side the shipping lanes because of shallow water and shoals and things like that. And then the Iranians have a much bigger prospect on the Gulf than the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states do. So it's easier for them to control it. So we're seeing how geography makes a big difference. In terms of China, Taiwan, Taiwan is about 100 miles away from China. If Taiwan were the width of the English Channel, if it was just 20 miles away, the Taiwan Strait, China would have conquered Taiwan decades ago. Geography is so basic and it's so obvious that it often gets ignored.
I mean, the thing about geography is it doesn't change. The location between China and Taiwan doesn't change. Where things are in the Middle East doesn't really change. With that being the case, isn't it the case that a lot of these current conflicts, such as in the Persian Gulf or with Iran, are both predictable and avoidable if a lot of these are driven by geography?
No, I don't think they are, because states have different agendas, different goals, and they clash. There is no night watchman to keep the peace in international affairs. Napoleon said that if you know a nation's geography, you can predict its foreign policy. And there's a lot of truth to that, though as I've written in later years that it all begins with geography and it all ends with Shakespeare. In terms of the peculiarities, the psychological peculiarities of leaders. So we have a combination of two things: geography and Shakespeare, which are driving international affairs.
Well, you've also described a world in permanent crisis. If you had to pick one fault line that could turn into chronic instability into a true systemic rupture, what would it be today?
Well, let me put it this way.
Yeah.
It's been impressive the way financial markets have priced in disturbances in the Middle East, including this one. The S&P 500 is just about back where it was before the war even started. So we can all argue about the Iran war, but nobody's really seeing a catastrophic decline in their monthly retirement accounts, etc. But if we were to have a high-end military conflict in the Pacific, in the South China Sea, Taiwan, we could have a catastrophic decline in people's life savings that the Federal Reserve would not be able to correct immediately, the way it corrected the COVID crisis. And that's because in the Pacific, you're dealing with all the great sea lines of communication, obviously, but also with supply chains to a degree you're not dealing with in the Persian Gulf. You have most of the microchips are made in Taiwan. and you have the world's greatest economic powers all engaged: China, the United States, and Japan. So I would say, as bad as this crisis in Iran has been, it would be far, far worse if there were ever a war in the Pacific.
Interesting. On Ukraine, if we take geography and Russian threat perception seriously, what does a realistic end state look like over the next decade in that conflict?
Well, Ukraine is, remember, the czar, the Russian czar, had a title, and the title was the czar of all the Russias. What were the Russias? There was Great Russia, what we consider Russia today. There was White Russia, which is Belarus. And then there was Little Russia, which is Ukraine. So Ukraine is more integrated historically into Russia than Taiwan is into China, so to speak. So I don't Ukraine. I think the best end result for Ukraine would be an independence and in some sort of associated agreement with the EU. Where it would be not belligerent to Russia, so to speak. So it would be sort of like Austria during the Cold War or Finland during the Cold War: independent, prosperous, free, capitalistic, but aware of Russian sensibilities.
Do you think that will happen?
I'm not sure. I think that the defeat of Viktor Orban in Hungary puts tens of billions of more dollars in Ukraine's pocket, because it'll lead to the releasing of funds from the EU for Ukraine that Orban was blocking. So that election, was a bad day for Putin. So to speak. But we'll see. We'll see how long each side can last.
What?
In other words, I'm very pessimistic on the future of Russia, regardless of who wins the war, because I think 4 years of war in Ukraine have so debilitated the Russian economy and society that Russia is less and less able to project power in the to project power in the Caucasus, in former Soviet Central Asia, in Siberia, and in the Russian Far East.
Let's talk about that a little more. Some people were surprised that Orban lost after his authoritarian time in office, and other people were also surprised that he conceded right away. Specifically, did this surprise you, and what does it mean for Russia? And do we think that more of those leaders will find their way leaving the scene soon, such as Erdogan and Turkey? But more specifically, what does it mean for Russia? What does it mean for Putin? And what lessons should he take from this?
Well, keep in mind, you can't consider Orban a dictator because he gave up power. He voluntarily gave up power early in the evening before all the
Yeah.
results were in. So a dictator doesn't do that. Let's call him, for 16 years, he was democratically elected, but with strong dictatorial tendencies. Is the way to look at him. And look, 16 years in power is a long, long time in any democratic system, no matter how fixed it is, or no matter how many games he played with the electoral system. But leaders don't last that long in parliamentary systems, so, almost never. In our presidential system, Franklin Roosevelt was unique because he lasted 4 terms, but there was a war on. There was a world depression and a world war on. So, his leaving, he's been defeated by a fellow conservative, a fellow nationalist who will play by the rules of the EU. That's the big difference. Play by the rules of NATO and the EU. So I think The EU will function much more effectively vis-a-vis Ukraine now. I think as much trouble as we have with Russia, remember, Russia has historically been a weakly institutionalized system under the czars, under the commissars, under Yeltsin, under Putin. And with that, and what that means is if Putin gets sick or he is unable to govern, it's unclear what could happen to Russia. I mean, in China is strongly institutionalized. If Xi Jinping got sick tomorrow, the Chinese would elect a new general secretary, and China could change dramatically, but China would go on as a stable organized bureaucratic system. It's unclear that would happen in Russia. Russia could face real instability. Post Putin, it could become a low-calorie version of the former Yugoslavia. It's unclear.
It seems to me that Russia is a dying empire, and that when we're reading history books in 2100, Russia really won't matter. These little conflicts will seem small compared to future conflicts with China. Would you agree with that assessment?
Not completely, because if you look at Russian history, Russia has had a tendency to collapse and then come back. It's always come back. After the Cold War, people thought Russia was finished. It was chaotic under Boris Yeltsin. And now look where we are, sort of. I mean, Russian culture is very deeply embedded. It's produced a great literature. It goes back millennia. I think there will always be a large Russia, but Russia could go through a period of great instability after Putin.
Yeah, I think for all of our Tolstoy fans, they would agree. You've hit on the EU, but I want to talk a bit more about that. Once the war in Iran broke out, the EU kind of famously, this was on a Friday, said, we have to deal with this on Monday. I think a lot of people see the EU as being feckless and weak, and frankly, the president does. Why does the EU still matter if they aren't going to carry their weight in the conflicts around the world?
Remember, the EU is not a political military organization. It's an
Mhm.
economic organization. And it governs a combined territory, I think a little bit larger than the United States, with a little bit more of a population. It's enormously wealthy. It's enormously functioning, so to speak. So what we're really talking about is not the EU but NATO. What will NATO do about the Iran war? And I think this war showed, at least in the Trump years, a further weakening of the relationship between the United States and NATO. Because simply by calling for the U.S. to withdraw from NATO, even if it is just bluster, has a way of diminishing the alliance in a number of ways. So, and usually when America has faced military conflicts, it has been able to stage weaponry and troops in NATO countries. This time, all the staging was in Israel, or a lot of it was in Israel, at Israeli Air Force bases. And NATO is just out of it, essentially. NATO is against the war, at least quite a number of its members. So I think we're seeing an historical weakening of the Atlantic Alliance.
Well, where did NATO go wrong over the past 25 years, from the second
I
Iraq
don't
war
think
to
I don't think NATO went wrong so much. Remember, NATO was established in 1949 to keep the Germans down and the Russians out, essentially, and it succeeded greatly in that. NATO even succeeded greatly after the end of the Cold War with the interventions in Bosnia and Kosovo. Um, uh, there was problematic their deployments in Afghanistan. They had rules of engagement so strict that countries like Germany really were almost a hindrance to the United States effort rather than an asset. and it did not take part, with the exception of Great Britain, in the Iraq War. So that was a certain weakening, regardless of what you think of the Iraq and Afghan wars. But I think where NATO went wrong was this. Go back to 2010. We had a defense secretary, Robert Gates, working for Barack Obama. And working for Barack Obama, and Gates went to Europe and gave a speech in Brussels and said, if NATO members don't dramatically, immediately raise their defense budgets, at some point there will come into power an American leader who will not put up with it anymore. And NATO, of course, did nothing. The NATO countries did nothing. They assumed that the United States had no choice but to defend them anyway. And well, now you see President Trump is elected twice, and we finally have a leader in America who's not pro NATO. Yes, NATO in certain instances has raised in its defense budget. Poland, Greece have very high defense budgets, etc. But generally speaking, in 1949, Europe was devastated. America was wealthy. America could bear the burden of European defense. And as the decades marched on and Europe got wealthier and America got comparatively poorer, that trade-off held less and less. And that teed up a president like Donald Trump.
Well, do you think that that NATO can survive if the U.S. does leave? And do you think that the U.S. actually would leave, or is it just further bluster from Trump?
My instinct is that he won't leave, that NATO will survive. But for it to prosper and be a really coherent, decisive alliance, we'll need two things. We'll need a new American president, and we'll need higher defense budgets among the countries that are not contributing enough to their defense.
We're talking to Mark Rutte next month, so I think he would be happy to hear that you think they're going to survive. But one of the bigger things that I think about quite often is this discussion of if Western style democratic liberalism, us, Europe, can survive versus the top down authoritarian governments of places like China. And just look at COVID, for example. When COVID broke out, even the discussion about whether or not people should have masks in the US was political and stalled, and it took forever, versus China, where they basically shut it down in a matter of minutes. Do you think in the 21st century, as opposed to the 20th century or 19th century, our form of government can still succeed when compared to much faster and more efficient governments in places like China?
Yes, I do. I think it can succeed. Democracy is always late to the party, and it's got a lot of problems, but I think it will survive and prosper. Trump is not the end of the line for the United States. And also, an authoritarian regime like China, precisely because it is authoritarian, masks a lot of problems underneath. I would rather have America's problems than China's problems. In other words, and remember, Xi Jinping, precisely because he is so autocratic, so Leninist, could be the end of the line for the communist dynasty in China. We've had different Chinas under different leaders. We've had Mao's anarchic revolutionary regime. We've had Deng Xiaoping and his acolytes Mandarinate. And now we have Xi's Leninist authoritarianism. Xi will not be the leader forever. There will be different Chinas, new Chinas in the future.
You hit on Taiwan earlier. Since we're talking about China, a lot of people anticipate that they will try to take Taiwan by 2029, of course, or earlier. Do you think that's the case? And if so, is the U.S. ready for that conflict?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. There are many ways to achieve unification that do not involve an invasion or a blockade. The Chinese have historically been patient. They can always redefine their 2029 goal as a directional goal rather than an absolute goal. What worries me, though, is that Trump seems to be leaning to giving up on Taiwan in order to make a deal with an economic deal with Xi that will help American economy. And I think, though, the pundits, the journalists will herald that as a decline in American-Chinese tensions. It will actually achieve the opposite. It will make the Chinese more susceptible to miscalculating on Taiwan.
Okay. You were in and around the room when the Iraq War, the second one, was being discussed. How is the conflict in Iran different besides some of the obvious reasons?
Well, the obvious reasons are there are no ground troops at this
Yet.
point. Yeah, it's true. I authored an article in Foreign Affairs called The Curse of Middle-Sized Wars that was generally opposed to this war because I saw the possibilities of of going into what I called a middle-sized war. And the United States has handled little rescue operations well, like Grenada, Panama, the Balkan interventions, and it's handled great big wars like the two world wars very well. Where American democracy has had trouble is in what I call the middle-sized wars that are big enough to cause an enormous bloodshed and instability, but small enough so that most Americans don't need to pay attention, kind of. And we saw this in Vietnam, we saw it in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Iran still is on the cusp. If it ends now, it will still be seen as a small war in 5 or 10 years. But if we go deeper, inserting ground troops, getting into a more complicated conflict with Iran, it could evolve from a small war to a middle-sized war. And that would be very difficult for the United States.
How should President Trump and the U.S. navigate itself out of the war?
Well, at this point, the options are all problematic because when you're dealing with, it seems that we've only replaced hardline leaders with more hardline leaders. And these hardline leaders have nowhere to retreat to because if they lost power, they would likely be arrested and in a number of cases executed. So there's no way out for them. It's not like the Cold War. Remember, when Ronald Reagan left office, the Cold War was still going on. It ended 11 months later after he left office, but it ended peacefully because the communist leaders in the various East Bloc countries were not hated by the population so much. It was the system that they hated. The leaders were generally tired old bureaucrats, so they could lose power and keep their lives, essentially. That would not be the case with Iran. So, you can destroy a leadership, you can destroy most of a nuclear program, you could destroy most of the missiles, but the journey from that to real regime change could be 1,000,000 miles away.
It seems to me that people are quick to point out the differences in this conflict, but I think it all starts with the Iraq War for different reasons. And I would love your take on this. But obviously, launching the Iraq War, getting rid of Saddam Hussein led to the rise of AQI, Al Qaeda in Iraq, and then ISIS forced Israel to sort of beef up even more. And then a lot of that drifted into Iran. What do you think in 10 to 15 years we'll look at from this conflict and say this caused where we are today? Like, what potential damage could we be having long term that we're not thinking about?
Let me give you an alternative scenario going backwards in history,
Yeah.
which is that the killing of Qasem Soleimani I think it was in 2020. I can't remember exactly, in January.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, had a profound effect because Qasem Soleimani held tightly onto the proxy armies in Hezbollah, Gaza, etc. And had he not been executed, October 7th might not have happened, or happened the way that it did, because Soleimani was both a brilliant tactician and a brilliant strategist, and he may have seen that plan and say, no, that's too provocative. We're not ready for a wider war with Israel. But Soleimani was gone. He was replaced by number two people who weren't as good. October 7th happened, and that led by steps to everything we have now, in many ways. I think that at some point the regime in Iran will change. Because remember, it's destroyed the currency, destroyed the middle class. The electrical system doesn't work well. There's a massive shortage of potable water. I mean, you're dealing with a real angry regime in months, and maybe real angry populace. Months, a year down the road, 2 years down the road, we could see a change in the regime.
Okay. You wrote The Tragic Mind out of remorse over the Iraq War and what you call optimistic overreach. When you watch debates on arming partners, sanctions, and regime change, what most resembles the mindset of 2002? And do you think our leaders, going back to our previous point, are thinking more first order, second order, third order than they were 25 years ago?
I think the key is not to think of what you can do, but ask the question, what then? Then what? So we take out the leadership. What do we do next? It's a matter of chess moves, thinking several steps down the road. The mindset of the Iraq war was not the Iraq war so much. It was fine. We can depose Saddam. We can do that. What do we do next? And that led to poor post-war, post-Saddam planning that led to the morass and everything. I think there was a little bit of that in the room when Trump decided to go to war in Iran.
Interesting. My final question for you: do you think it matters anymore if the public supports military action, especially for someone like Trump, who doesn't have to win another election? Can he sort of act unilaterally for the next 3 years because he has no consequences?
A president gets a pass from the public as long as there are no significant casualties. It's not the money that's spent or the time. It's that you're allowed, in this war, you'd be allowed 100 casualties. If you had 500 casualties, the whole public would revolt, would revolt against it. That was the issue in Vietnam and in Iraq.
Okay. Well, final question for you. If you were advising the next president in January of 2029, looking at the world, what would you tell him to focus on, and what would you advise him? What would you advise that his underlying thesis of the world should be?
Have a sense of the tragic. Think that things can go wrong. Once you start a war, you have no idea where it's going to go, how it will evolve. So be very wary of the conflicts you get into.
Okay. Robert Kaplan, thanks for joining Clearer Than Truth. For our listeners, where can they follow your work?
They can read Wasteland, A World in Permanent Crisis, my most recent book.
Wonderful. Thanks again, and we'll be sure to have you on again soon. Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and share with your friends.